Hi, everyone. I want to thank you all so much for joining us in our discussion with Devika Bhushan, the former California Acting Surgeon General, as she candidly shares her lived experience with bipolar disorder. Dr. Bhushan is a pediatrician and public health leader on a mission to drive health innovation, promote equity, destigmatize mental illness, and spread tools for resilience. As California's Acting Surgeon General in 2022, Dr. Bhushan was the key advisor to the California governor and led policy and practice innovation at a statewide level by co-leading the launch of ACE's Aware initiative. Her expertise spans trauma-informed systems, stress and resilience, mental health, and gender and health equity, with work published in the Lancet, Pediatrics, NPR, and the Los Angeles Times. Dr. Bhushan trained at Harvard and Johns Hopkins and serves as senior advisor to entities that aim to advance health, innovation, and equity. She also leads a well-being community to spread evidence-based tools for resilience through a newsletter and YouTube channel podcast called Spread the Light with Dr. Devika B. And I'll put both of those links in the chat so you can access those wonderful resources. And Dr. Bhushan is also an immigrant, parent, and first-generation Indian America. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Jake, for that very warm welcome. And it is so nice to be here with everybody in this community. I'm hoping that today's session, this hour that we have together, is really informal, and it's a chance for us to get to know each other and connect. So we want to spend a little bit of time on sort of a prepared set of remarks, just so you know sort of who I am and where I'm coming from and what my lenses are. And I'd love to spend the majority of our time together today in conversation. So really hearing from you as to what resonates, what questions you might have, what conversations we can have together. So with that, I will share just a couple of slides with you all. And I know Jake has started putting a couple of links in the chat. Feel free to check those out at your leisure.
So the links are on the chat for you to check out, as Devika just said. And as for the discussion part of the webinar, it will be a 40-minute question and answer session. So as you are listening to the presentation, feel free to start thinking about what questions you would like to ask and drop them in the questions box. We're going to try to answer as many as possible, and we are so excited to have this discussion.
So I'll be sharing some lessons learned from my journey with bipolar disorder. As Jake mentioned, in the past, I've served as Acting Surgeon General of California, and currently I advise a number of startups and other entities, as well as spend time in mental health activism. So this is just a list of all of the entities that I either advise or serve as a director in their board of directors for, and I'm not representing any of these entities in this conversation today. I'm representing myself and my work as a mental health activist. So just to start, I think everybody who has bipolar disorder or has been touched by a mental illness of some kind understands stigma very, very deeply and intimately. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page and starting from the same place as far as what we think about when we think about stigma, the word actually derives from Greek for a tattoo. And the tattoos that are being referred to here usually serve to mark somebody as different or less than. So often it would mark a slave or somebody who had been designated a criminal and had been kept separate from the rest of society. And what it does is it really serves to reduce somebody from a whole and usual person to a tainted and a discounted one. And these are the words of Irving Goffman, a sociologist. It involves labels and stereotypes that accompany a stigmatized identity. It often involves status loss and discrimination. When we think about mental illness stigma in particular, last year, the Lancet published a set of really wonderful writings about stigma and really helping us understand what kinds of interventions work and in what kinds of contexts, which we'll get to. They also did a small but diverse survey in 45 different countries with people who had mental illnesses of different kinds. And they asked them the extent to which they agreed that stigma and discrimination can be worse than the impact of the mental health condition itself. And 4 out of 5 people with lived experience said that this was true, that the stigma that they were experiencing related to their mental illness actually was a worse experience than that illness itself. And we know that self-stigma in particular, the extent to which we have internalized negative beliefs about ourselves based on the cultural scripts that are out there related to a stigmatized identity like a mental illness, we know that that kind of self-stigma directly increases our likelihood of completing suicide, and reduces our likelihood of staying well. So reduces help seeking, reduces recovery success, while increasing the number and duration of episodes and hospitalizations. This is what it sounds like. The folks on this webinar are likely very familiar with what it sounds like in your own lives, but these are some statements I've heard. And the first one, you can't trust anything she says. She's bipolar. She's probably lying. Intentionally presenting this as sort of condition first language rather than person first language, because that's how it was posed. But this was said by a colleague when I was in medical training, and it was about a patient on sign out in the morning. And the patient had bipolar disorder in their chart, but their admission overnight had nothing to do with bipolar disorder. There had been an altercation between the patient and the roommate. And essentially, this was the way the altercation had been presented in the morning to the team of doctors taking back over in the morning from the overnight team. The second one, why would you want to pass this on to a child, was said to me by a psychiatrist as I was trying to think about family planning and all my options and what it could mean to have a biological child. When I had a biological child, I was told I'll never be a good parent with this disorder. I will leave off, since this is a public webinar, specifically what the relationship between me and that person was, but I heard it at least from one person, and I'm sure lots of other people thought it. And after I disclosed my journey publicly, which I did last year, I had a lot of acquaintances come up to me and say, hey, I didn't know that about you. And I actually would have never guessed that you have this disorder, right? Because if you think about and deconstruct what that means, it means there's a specific cultural script about what kind of people have bipolar disorder, what kind of traits they might have. And there just isn't room sometimes in that cultural script for people who don't fall into those stereotypes very neatly. And so coming back to the Lancet Commission paper that I mentioned, they essentially reviewed 216 systematic reviews that looked at interventions that aimed to reduce stigma of all sorts, right? Mostly public stigma, so the opinions and feelings and behaviors that the public in general, that people in general hold about mental health. And what they found essentially was that for an intervention to be successful, it had to have meaningful social contact between people who do have lived experience and people who don't. Right. And this may not surprise those of us who are on this webinar, right? Because we live and breathe and eat and know all of this very intimately. But what we know breaks down stereotypes and stigma and shame around mental illness are representations of mental illness and recovery journeys that are whole, that are three-dimensional, that are nuanced, that really help people understand that it's not just one kind of person who has bipolar disorder, and you can't always tell from the outside which of us will have it and which of us don't have it. And so I was privileged, last year to serve as acting surgeon general in a really meaningful time and place in terms of where we were with the pandemic. And it really felt at that moment last year in August of 2022 that most people had their own real struggle or lived experience with mental illness of some kind, or had been intimately involved with a family member or a loved one through some kind of a journey that was like that. And so for better or for worse, it felt like the right time in my life, but also the right time sort of externally for me to share my journey with bipolar disorder. And I wanted to do it while serving as acting Surgeon General to really help break down stigma and stereotypes and help people understand too, if you were going through something dark and difficult, that you were not alone. When I was going through my own dark and difficult times, I actually didn't have a single role model that I knew of directly who was in my profession of medicine, who had this diagnosis and had found a way to come through it and to understand it and to live with it. And so that was part of it. And it was a really meaningful moment for me personally, because suddenly I was the exact same person to my friends and to my family that I was publicly. So my insides matched my outsides, to use my friend Dr. Pooja Lakshman's phrase. And it landed me in the middle of a really powerful movement to continue to work on stigma reduction and spreading tools that help everybody, no matter where they are and who they are, access what they need to stay well. And there's, we can talk so much about that piece of it, but I'm just so thankful to have found the acceptance and the community that came from this disclosure. And so now some of what I do with the time that I spend in the mental health activism space, we heard about it a little bit from Jake in the introduction. I spend, every week I publish an edition of a newsletter called Ask Dr. Devika B, and the link here will guide anyone to it who's interested. And essentially it helps to democratize tools for well-being and resilience. And every Wednesday morning, folks will get an email with a newsletter of some kind in that domain. The second thing is a podcast, and it's essentially not only a podcast, it's a storytelling platform called Spread the Light with Dr. Devika B. It comes out in my newsletter once a month. It comes out as a podcast and as a YouTube channel. So I spend time with other brave souls who have wanted to talk through their mental illness journeys and their recovery journeys, key lessons learned, superpowers that they might have gained from those experiences. And so they always share super poignant and just heartfelt lessons and moments in those stories. I'm working on a documentary film as a senior advisor to a team who is stupendous. It's called Brainstorm. It'll probably be out in about 2 years. We're in the planning phases right now, and we'll begin filming this fall. And the idea really is to help educate the public and the medical workforce about bipolar disorder, because right now there's actually an 11-year period of time that elapses between people's first symptoms with bipolar 2 disorder and proper diagnosis and treatment. And there's a lot of signs and symptoms that get missed along the way, and people are suffering and dying because of it. And so part of Brainstorm's mission is to help educate specifically the primary care workforce, where a lot of us will go if we first develop symptoms of depression. But then 1 in 3 people who develop symptoms of depression will actually end up being on the bipolar spectrum. And if they're started on antidepressants, as I was, as a lot of people are, they can get worse before they get better, have symptoms of hypomania, mania, or mixed episodes, and really suffer. And it can be hard actually to properly identify hypomania when it happens, especially first time that it happens in somebody who may never have had that experience before, may not have had a family history of that experience before, which is how it happened for me. And it can show up as, being revved up. It can show up as anxiety and be misdiagnosed and mistreated. And a number of advocacy projects, which we can get into in a minute. But I'd love to share my top 9 mental health lessons. Most of them have been learned the hard way. And I'll pause here just to give you a snippet of what my mental health journey has been to this point, so sort of where these lessons are coming from. briefly, my mental health journey started 14 years ago. I was ending my first year of medical school at Harvard. It had gone well. I then had this extremely intense summer where I was spending time in a remote location on my own, setting up a program for the first time in that setting, speaking in my third language, and feeling very disconnected from all of my usual supports and systems and familiar structures. A couple of, intense and traumatic events transpired, and I ended that summer there feeling very much unlike myself. I couldn't sleep. I didn't know what to say to people when they made small talk. It took me a lot of effort, all of my effort, to come up with the exact right thing to say. I was feeling just very out of sorts, and I thought it would go away once I got back to my home, and it didn't. It continued, and just, if anyone's felt depressed ever in your life, sometimes the first time it happens to you, you don't even recognize it, right? Because clinically speaking, we had learned about depression in school, but when I experienced it, I didn't experience it the way that I had read about it, if that makes sense. Like, I, for some reason, thought that your mood had to be low, but I didn't feel sad. I just felt vacant. I just felt like I was absent, and cognitively just unable to process and make decisions, fatigued, but not able to sleep at all overnight, not able to make sense of, the work that I had to do, et cetera. And so, I was diagnosed with depression, and I personally had never had an episode of hypomania or mania, or depression. Actually, this was my first mood episode of any kind. I also at the time didn't have a family history of bipolar disorder. And so, I was diagnosed with straightforward unipolar depression and started on antidepressants. And then for about 2.5 years, I was trialed on up to 20 different kinds of medications. None of them really worked. And instead of addressing my depressive symptoms, what happened was they layered this sort of hypomanic activation onto the baseline depression that I was experiencing. And so I was just agitated and couldn't sleep and anxious and depressed. Finally, I got onto 3 different activating antidepressants. And what ended up happening was I had a manic episode. And to be honest, that manic episode probably saved my life, because all of a sudden it wasn't, just smoldering hypomania on top of my depression that was not being necessarily recognized. You can't argue with, mania, and you suddenly have a very definitive diagnosis that, this is not unipolar depression, this is bipolar spectrum. And that opens up a whole other arsenal of tools in terms of mood stabilizers for medications and adjunctive behavioral treatments. And so I was on the right treatments. It took me about 6 months after that diagnosis to really stabilize on a new regimen. After that high, was very, very depressed and suicidal, and then was cycling sort of up and down for a little while, and then finally stabilized 6 months later. Ended up, this was now, from a timeline perspective, a year before I was to graduate from medical school. So I was able to graduate, do research, get honors, get married that year to somebody, who I'm still with and have been with now for 17 plus years through all of these, ups and downs. And subsequently, I had 2 further episodes in medical training in the context of day-night switches or 30-hour shifts where you're staying up for over a day. And while those kinds of shifts are really unhealthy for most people, for everybody, I would say, they can be unusually toxic for somebody who has a bipolar brain, because those of us with bipolar disorder are very sensitive to circadian rhythm shifts. And so I had, 2 major mood episodes in residency in the context of day-night switches and 28-hour calls. And since 2015, which was my last episode, I've been able to be well, maintain, all of the habits and the patterns that I know are going to help stabilize me and keep me in a good place. I've been able to experience two kind of high intensity periods of my life, one of which was having a baby 2 years ago, the second of which was spending about 3.5 years in state government during the start and then the rise of the pandemic. And, I think that one of the things I learned is that outside of circadian rhythm shifts, there's really nothing that's out of bounds for somebody who has bipolar disorder or has a mental illness in general. I think everybody's story and everybody's package of what works well for them is going to look slightly different. But there's no, a priori, there's nothing that you have to skip or not do or can't do personally or professionally through a mental illness journey. And so I'd just like to share just a couple of my quick lessons. Again, everybody's story is totally different. And some of these may really resonate with some and others less so. But I'd invite you to reflect on sort of what your tools of your journeys have been and consider sharing them, because the more people that speak openly about their mental illnesses and recoveries, the better we are as a society in terms of what stereotypes and stigma can look like. So number one is that you can't rush recovery, right? So when you are ill and your brain is hijacked by illness, it is a really disconcerting experience because everything is affected. Your thoughts, your feelings about yourself, your feelings about the future. And it's really hard to sit in that place and not know when it's going to end. And I write more about this in my newsletter, but it's really important to, in those moments, not buy into those dark thoughts about this is never going to end. I'm always going to feel like this, because you can remind yourself that you have felt well and you will feel well again. You just can't predict when exactly it's going to happen. Number two, when you're in that place where things are really hard, it's so important to set small goals and then to celebrate those wins. So for instance, if you're in a place where you're depressed, it's gonna be super counterproductive to expect yourself to sit down, read a chapter in a scientific textbook or write an article. Like those things cognitively are going to be well-timed activities, right? So instead, give yourself a goal of getting up and taking a shower, walking around the block and paying attention to the birds that are chirping rather than the ruminating thoughts that are in your brain. And when you're able to do these things, even for a moment or two, just celebrate those small wins, and then they're going to stack up. And one day you're going to be having medium wins, and then you're going to be having big wins. And before you know it, you're going to be out of that really hard place. Normalize time off for mental health reasons. And you don't have to go into all of the reasons about why you need time off when you're seeking time away from school or work. You can use a general descriptor like a health issue, and trust your gut about what you need. Sometimes what you need is actually the stability and structure of a routine that maybe your school or your workplace does provide you. And other times it might be counterproductive to be trying to seem normal, quote unquote, and getting the work done while also focusing on getting well. So just trust your gut. And the next piece of this is relying on the people in your support group. When you are feeling unwell, the last thing sometimes you want to do is ask for help because you don't feel like you deserve it sometimes. And your loved ones just want you to be better and they want to know how to help you get there. And sometimes what can help is when you're well, to sit down and really think about, okay, what can I ask this specific person in my life to help me with when I am next not feeling well? Could it be help with childcare? Could it be help with listening to what the doctor is saying during the doctor's visit and taking good notes so that we can think about our options or decisions to be made later? Be really specific, and it's the kind of thing where it helps to think it through ahead of time and even tell people, like tap people ahead of time and say, hey, when I get hypomanic, my behavior becomes like this. Here's what I'd love for you to do, or here's what I have found really helpful, or even I'd prefer if you didn't do X or Y, right? Because people aren't going to know what's going to help you unless they hear it from you and unless they understand what you want. And of course, you can change your mind at any point of this, right? You might have told someone to do something ahead of time, and then in the moment you say, hey, you know what? This doesn't feel as good as I was hoping it would. Let's try something different. But don't be afraid to engage your network, because they are there for you, and you can be there for them in the exact same ways when you are feeling well again. And then this is transitioning to sort of just lifetime maintenance, well-time mode behaviors. So this is one of my favorites, because as we all know, our healthcare system is super fragmented. This goes for information that we need, such as lab results. It goes for, discharge summaries for when we're hospitalized or have a surgery. This is a really important one, and it probably stems from me being in medical school when all of this went down. But this I think has stood me in the most good stead in terms of being my own best steward. As I've moved my care from place to place to place, I've had probably, even though I've only had a 14-year mental health journey, I've had probably a dozen psychiatrists and probably a dozen therapists in that time. And so it's been really important to show up sort of with my own summary of what has happened. I mean, it's a super short bulleted summary of, here were my episodes, here were the triggers, here were the medications I tried, here were the ways in which those medications either helped or didn't help. And there's a couple of other elements of it too that I describe on my Substack. But the piece that's been the most useful is I have this Excel spreadsheet of my labs over time. And you can start to figure out those little trends and nudges, and really help your treatment team make data-driven decisions about how to change your meds, or what to do differently, or what to do more of or less of. And labs are one of those things, it's really hard to coalesce them over many systems. So if you can start to build that for yourself from sort of the beginning of your trajectory, or even the middle of your trajectory onwards, it's going to be super invaluable. Number 6 is creating space for joy. And I'm a toddler mom. I don't have a lot of, for spare time to play with. But for me, I remember the words of one of my favorite therapists who said that you have to tune into a different frequency when you want to feel a little bit differently or better. And this is, it's as small as choosing to pay attention to the heat of the shower as I'm, showering between whatever else I'm doing, or walking outside and instead of sort of being in my head, and I shared this example earlier, tuning into that frequency of the birds that I am passing by and would otherwise miss. And just intentionally inculcating spaces, moments, even those small spaces and moments for joy. And then on the other side of that, creating a red flag toolbox. So what does that mean? Everybody's symptoms look different, even with the same diagnosis, right? So what somebody might experience with hypomania or mania at those very early signs and stages in the first hours or days of experiencing a symptom, it's over time, it's possible to sort of be attuned, right, to your own sort of variations in mood, and to figure out, okay, today I am doing this differently, and so I should worry. And this is sort of a red flag of, if this keeps going, I'm going to be in a hypomanic episode. And what can you do in those very early moments when you've caught and tuned into those early symptoms to dial them back and bring yourself back to baseline? So for me, for instance, it's not that since 2015, I've never had symptoms. It's that I am now really attuned to the early warning symptoms of both the hypomanic side and the depressive side. And I have tools in my arsenal that I've experimented with and figured out work well for me to bring my mood back to baseline. And so this is all trial and error, and we can talk more about specifics in the Q&A, but really important to think about. And this one, this is about protecting your sleep, which is, of course, a cardinal rule in bipolar disorder. I will share one of my my key ways of sort of regulating my sleep, which is exposure to early morning light. So sometime in the first half of the day, I try to do it as early as possible, about 30 minutes or more if I have the time. And then on the other side of that, when things are, when it's 3 or 4 hours before bed, I pull out my amber glasses, and you'll see they are well loved. One of the sides is missing a side. I'm also traveling right now, and of course my toddler loves picking up whatever I love to use. So he sees me use this every night, and so we'll give the score for cutting off the edge of that to him. But essentially, what this does, many of you may know, amber glasses will be able to block blue light from hitting your retina, right? And that is the wavelength of light that actually wakes the brain up. So when we're sitting down at night, looking at our phones, watching TV, etc., a lot of why that experience is activating is the blue light that's hitting our retina, where we think that it's daytime. And then the brain sends a signal to our melatonin system, right, which is the sleep-inducing hormone, to essentially shut that down because it's daytime. So this reverses all of that. This is like your shield or your cape at night. And I even use it when I'm not, exposing myself to artificial light or screens. I sometimes will just use it at night, and it's super helpful for jet lag and other things as well. Second piece of this is protecting your energy. So we all have things that either give us energy and fill us up, and things that deplete our energy and wear us down. And it's really important to be conscious of how you're spending your days, your weeks, your months, and sort of really allocating space for both kinds of activities. So for instance, if I've just had a very energy depleting set of experiences or interactions, I will block time on my calendar to try to have opposing kind of energetic experiences as well, things that are going to fill me up and make me feel restored and repleted before I go back out for that next energy drain or using experience. And then this is my last one, and it's a hard one, but really around practicing self-compassion. I'm a recovering perfectionist. And I think I've learned the hard way that, there are always going to be ups and downs. There's no experience or person or product that is perfect. That just doesn't exist, right? And having a lot of compassion and love for yourself through all of your ups and downs. Even if we're well today, we may not be well tomorrow, and that's just part of the deal. And learning to kind of roll with that, and to forgive yourself for things you may have done when you were unwell, to forgive yourself for whatever is, ahead of you or in the moment for you that feels hard or less than, to just give yourself a lot of grace and to love yourself despite all of the things that are not perfect. And I think, I alluded to this in the past, but, any kind of really tough journey leaves you with superpowers. So, there's this beautiful Rumi quote, and my son's name is Rumi, so I love this quote especially. "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And to me, what this really solidifies or encapsulates is the fact that any of us who walk through something that is really, truly difficult, we emerge on the other end of that more unique and stronger, and in a place where we're much less likely to crack or break again. And so this vessel that you see in front of you represents the art of kintsugi, which is a Japanese tradition whereby where a ceramic cracks, you don't throw it out in all of its shattered pieces. You actually put it back together using resin that includes gold. And what you're left with is something that's unique, more beautiful, and hardier. And so one of the questions I always love to ask on my podcast is, what superpowers or unique assets has has your journey been able to give you? So I'd love to close with just that and see if folks have questions and comments and other conversation, and wanted to share again some of the links on the screen here. And I will stop share so we can see each other a little bit better.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Devika. So before we get into the question and answer from our attendees, one thing I would like to learn more about is, may you please describe the experience you had living with bipolar disorder and your pregnancy and postpartum?
Absolutely. It's such an important question, and it's one that I love to talk about because it's very misunderstood. So, one of the things that we hear out there in the ethos is that, and not just in the ethos, I've heard it from practicing psychiatrists as well, who may not be up to sort of the latest evidence around postpartum psychiatry and peripartum psychiatry. And that is that people often assume that most of the medications that we use to treat bipolar disorder, you can't continue them if you become pregnant. And that's not true for the majority of mood stabilizers. So, the regimen that I was on was lithium and Seroquel. And I stayed on the exact same meds with the exact same doses while I was pregnant. There is a little bit more monitoring that has to take place. But outside of that, it's safe and possible to stay on a lot of medications while you're pregnant. And postpartum, you are at risk for an episode of some kind, whatever your mental health history. And for mood disorders in particular, we know that sleep is key to try to prevent that mood episode in the postpartum period. Up to a year, you might be at risk. So the way that I did that was I was super intentional about needing to get 8 hours of sleep a night, basically as soon as I delivered, and I tried to do what I could to do that during pregnancy also. And one of the decisions that my psychiatrist and I made to enable that to happen was we decided that I wouldn't breastfeed at all, that we would do formula feeding from the get-go, because what that meant is when you're breastfeeding, you're pumping or doing some kind of an activity, every 2, 3, 4 hours, which means that you can't have a full night of rest. It means you necessarily have to truncate and interrupt your night of sleep. And when we opted to formula feed, it meant anybody could give our baby the formula, right? It wasn't one source. And we also invested in a night doula who helped us take care of our baby during the first several weeks of his life when he wasn't yet sleeping through the night. And that meant that, my husband and my mom, who was also staying with us, didn't necessarily have to take on kind of that double shift of day and night. And it also, since our baby started sleeping through the night, my husband has taken it on to do nights when our baby has a regression, when we have an illness that we're dealing with that makes him wake up through the night, as well as early mornings. So I put our child to sleep at night. I do the bedtime routine with him, and then my husband is in charge sort of beyond that point up until the early morning. And that has been really, really key. But even though it is hard and you have to plan for it, it is very possible to protect your sleep to the degree that we did, and to stay well through that pregnancy and postpartum period. I was honestly terrified that I wouldn't be able to enter parenthood feeling like myself. And because I knew what the percentages of people who have recurrences of a mood disorder during that period of time, they're very high. It's a very scary set of numbers to look at. But I want people to also know that with the right resources, privileges, and yes, I had a lot of privileges, and planning around that period, that you can stay well and you can stay feeling like yourself. And of course, there's ups and downs, like quote unquote normal postpartum blues, where you're overwhelmed and anxious and having crying bouts, but not, sustained depression or hypomania. And so I was really thankful for that.
And thank you so much for sharing all that. I'm sure that will really make an impact to our audience. And our next question is from an audience member who is a future surgeon themselves. They're currently applying for residency, but are feeling lost about how transparent they should be about their diagnosis, as if they don't say anything, they feel like they might be seen as lazy and not ambitious enough. So do you have any advice for what they're going through and how they can go about disclosing their diagnosis possibly?
Yes, it is such a good question, and I'm always happy to chat offline if you'd like to talk more. But my general 2 cents there are: I entered residency thinking I've got the right diagnosis, I'm on the right regimen, I'm invincible, right? And my brain broke because of the way in which the schedule disrupted nights and circadian rhythm, essentially. And after those episodes, I went back with accommodations in place that said, I'm only going to do days, and I'm not going to do these 30-hour shifts. And what I would encourage you to do is to think hard with your psychiatrist, of course, about whether that's a possibility for you to take those kinds of accommodations from the get-go. And I think you should talk with your program director and or advisor, depending on the system that you're in, as far as who's in charge of the schedule, and really try to protect yourself in that way, because residency is really hard. It's very trying. You're making mistakes and you're learning from your mistakes, and you're constantly at your growth edge and doing things that are uncomfortable. And it's hard enough as it is without giving yourself that additional biological circadian disruption that your brain just is going to do less well with than somebody else's brain might. So just to kind of be honest with yourself around that, talk to your psychiatrist, see if you can talk with your program director and come up with a plan that helps you stay safe and healthy during your training.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And as we're on the topic of circadian rhythm, our next question reads, you noted that circadian rhythm shifts are problematic. How do you handle travel?
Yeah, and here's the thing. I have always lived 12 hours apart from my kind of core family. So I grew up in the Philippines, in India, and the US. And so coming, to the US when I was 18, which is now, 18 years ago or more, I was always oceans apart from my family. And there was always this travel that was literal day-night flips, right? And for me, I know what to expect. I try to be really thoughtful about what I schedule. So for instance, I've been to India to visit my family twice in the last 12 months. Once was kind of for health stuff on their end, and another time was just a routine visit. But both times, like, I had to be very intentional, just like I am, as you guys might be as well, through time zone switches, about just doing it, trying to do the shift gradually, and then giving myself a week or two of buffer on arrival and on return, to not expect myself to be on full. So, sometimes I do, when I travel these long distances, just from the circadian shifts alone, I might have a little bit of hypomania for a week, or a little bit of a depression for a week. And I know sometimes that can be a possibility, and I don't schedule presentations and meetings that are with new people, intense deadlines, etc., for those 1 or 2 weeks. I just try to give myself a little bit of a breathing room, which is not to say I'm like completely off of work, but I'm doing work on my own pace, and I'm lucky to have that kind of flexibility in terms of what I can say yes and no to. But I try not to schedule like podcast interviews and intense things like that for at least a couple of weeks. And then I know that it's a finite stressor and circadian shift, and I'll come right out of it usually in a week or two. Mm-hmm. With the things that I need to do to get out of it, with my red flag toolbox.
That's great. So our next question is, do you have a special diet or do you recommend any diet that can help someone living with bipolar disorder?
I started to do more. Okay, well, let me think about this because my diet has really shifted over the time that I've had bipolar disorder. In general, I follow, I would say, a Mediterranean diet. So that's a lot of fruits and vegetables. It's very anti-inflammatory. It's low carb, healthy fats, right? So you can look up sort of what the components are. But I tend to think of everything as an experiment, right? And as long as what you're doing works for you, you can do things that are quote unquote no-nos in excess. You can do those things in moderation, right? One of the things I found really important early on in my journey was starting to have a protein-rich breakfast. So I have 2 eggs, sometimes avocado and toast with that. And that really keeps my energy boosted and my mood really stable for the majority of the day. I used to be somebody who had, cereal for breakfast, right? So just making a small change like that made a really big difference in the beginning of my journey. And I've kind of stayed with that. And then the rest of my meals are pretty, I would say, low carb, as I mentioned, and fairly fruit and veggie heavy.
That's great. Everyone has their own thing that works best for them. And that is great. Thank you for sharing that. So our next question reads, how can people with bipolar disorder cope with the impulsivity that mania can bring, whether that's finances, commitments, or decision-making? Have you had any experience with this or?
Yes, I've had a lot more experience with hypomania, just that one manic episode. What I will say is I have 2 rules that I love to stick with any mood episode, up or down. One of them is to stay off social media, because you can get in your own way and you can reveal what might be going on for you in a way that you might not want revealed, or that you might think differently about when you're totally well. And whatever we put out into the world online, and it's not just social media, if you have a blog or something else, or a YouTube channel, same thing goes. When you're feeling unwell, just kind of cut off those forever external channels of communication. That's number 1. And number 2 is think carefully about who you reveal your story and your diagnosis to when you're feeling unwell. And I think, that was a guideline that was shared with me early on in my journey. And I think it's a really useful one, because the way that you share your story when you're well is potentially very, very different. And then as far as kind of protecting assets like money and so forth, I think that's where you really have to work with your network and your loved ones and support systems to put into place specific remedies. So for instance, if you're somebody who does some impulsive spending when you're hypomanic or manic, talking with your, if you have a partner, strategies to sort of curtail that when you are in the throes of an unwell period. And it's going to look slightly different for everybody, but I think not blasting what's happening externally via social media, and then also being very careful about not sharing your story while you're unwell. I think those are 2 tenets that I found really useful that were shared with me early on.
And when it comes to sharing your story, when you disclose your diagnosis publicly, if you did feel any sort of backlash from patients, how long would you say that was? And was there a shift in treatment from your colleagues? And if there was, what was that like?
97 to 98% of the comments that I received were positive in nature. And to be honest with you, I was expecting a much lower percentage. I thought it would be like 9 to 1, right? But I got very little backlash. I actually, in fact, at that moment, I wasn't seeing patients, but but people who could have been patients who had reached out essentially afterwards were just really like grateful and inspired and motivated and wanted to, share their experiences and stories with me as well. So I was just blown away, honestly, by the reception. In terms of the colleagues part of that question, I think those who would have had something negative to say just didn't approach me. But lots of people who hadn't known, but were learning about it for the first time, did approach me and were really, really supportive. So I was really blessed that everyone was that it all went so, so well, and I wouldn't have been able to predict that beforehand. I was very nervous about what would happen.
That's really touching. I'm glad that was the case. And our next question is, how can someone make sure they can get back to their routine after a relapse? Whether that be, it could be a full-blown episode, or it could be showing symptoms that disrupts their routine. What are some good blocks to put into place to stick to their routine?
No, it's going to look slightly different for everybody, again, of course. But for me, I mentioned that it's important for me to get early morning sunlight, right? And so we just kind of found a way to build that structurally into our routine. For instance, we walk our baby to daycare, 20-25 minutes one way, and bring him back. And so if I do that in the morning, for instance, I get my exercise as well as my early morning sunlight. So that's kind of one way to think about sort of structural elements of your day that help you maintain your routine, or those elements that you need to stay well. I think it's also, to the extent possible, important to structure your day in a way that feels energetically kind, for lack of a better word. And for me, I'm an introvert. I do my best deep thinking work in the mornings. So that's the writing, the reading, the creative elements of my job. And then I do, webinars and meetings and so forth in the afternoons. And that's just something that I figured out works well for me, because then I can get in my sort of dedicated deep work time in the morning, and then sort of shunt the external work to the afternoons. So that's one other example. I think it's all a matter of figuring out sort of what gives you energy, what drains your energy, as I was saying earlier, and really trying to be thoughtful and mindful to the extent that it's possible in your work, which not every situation does have that privilege to be able to structure things exactly the way you want to do them. But just even to be thoughtful that, hey, like, I'm feeling totally depleted after my full day in the OR. And so maybe the following day I could spend an hour or two just catching up on me time, or whatever it is, whatever is possible, being careful and intentional about energetic distribution.
That's great. So our next question is, one of our attendees received a comment that was, "Oh, so you have bipolar? I finally get why you're so smart." And that rubbed them the wrong way a little bit, because can be seen as a backhanded compliment. Have you received similar comments, and how can you deal with them?
What a good question. I totally want to hear from this person about their experience and what they think about it. I've not had that experience in myself, like in terms of having had a comment like that, but yeah, I understand what you mean, because lots of people have lots of traits, and it doesn't necessarily tie back to their mental illness, right? Yeah. I mean, there is good, data that creativity and so forth goes hand in hand with bipolarity, but to kind of distill all of what you are and show up with to, oh, of course, because you have bipolar disorder, is just a little bit of a oversimplification.
That's great. So this is our final question that we will have time for today, and it is in regards to sleep. Is there anything that you would like to share about what enables you to sleep well?
So it's a combination of things. So that thing that I mentioned about the early morning light, it's not just about boosting your mood and your energy and your stability like during the daytime. It actually helps you set your circadian rhythms and your day night internally in a way that's really useful for sleep later at night. So you know that it's daytime when it's daytime, and then you turn that off with the amber glasses when it comes around to bedtime, and then that's a big part of it. So that's all, chronotherapy is the term for the strategic use of light and dark. So that's one big piece of it. I try to exercise in the first half of my day, as I was alluding to earlier. And for me, I'm somebody who I'm a walker. I like to walk. I walk to think, I walk to blow off steam, to process things. And so it all kind of works together. And it also allows me to be present and mindful in my body and in nature. And so I try to do that in the first half of the day. And again, that helps me with nighttime sleep. If I do it too late in the day, I find that it activates me too much, and then it can interfere with my sleep. All of the stuff around anti-inflammatory sort of Mediterranean diet, all of that is helpful for sleep too, because what it means is that you are essentially having fuel sources that are going to be broken down over a long period of time, rather than having these insulin spikes and crashes. And that is really also very helpful for staying asleep and falling asleep. I think those are the main ones. And I try not to watch, TV at night without my orange glasses on, but that's, related. Having social interactions is important, right? But having like them in the right doses. As I mentioned, I'm an introvert. And so just really being mindful of what kinds of interactions are going to be super activating, maybe in a negative way, and might keep me up, and trying to time those in a way that feels, it's not on the same night as like I'm working on something really big for work the next day or something like that. Yeah, those are my main ones. I'd love to hear others. If I wish this was more, if more of like a conversation with the room, but yeah, those are mine, I think.
Well, Devika, thank you so much. That was an amazing talk, a great discussion, and I'm sure our audience benefited immensely from it. And I want to remind everyone, if you would like to further connect with Devika, her podcast is Spread the Light with Dr. Devika B. Her newsletter is Ask Dr. Devika B. So feel free to reach out to her. And once again, thank you all so much for joining. And Devika, do you have any closing comments you would like to share?
I am just so thankful for spaces like this to be able to be our fullest and most authentic selves. And I am thankful for all of you being part of this conversation. And hopefully we can all connect offline in some capacity and spread the light. Mm-hmm. Thank you for having me. Of
course, thank you so much. And this webinar will be uploaded to ibpf.org as well as our YouTube channel. And with that being said, have a great day, everyone. Take care.